And that was You Spin Me Right Round from Dead or Alive with their cautionary AppSec lyrics. If I get to know your name, well, I could trace your private number. Hold tight, we're going to spin this new wave post-punk security hour right round, which means this week we talk with Ted Harrington on how to do AppSec right so we can move on from misconceptions and make a difference with security testing and development. In the news segment, I just can't get enough, Jason parsing. I ran so far away with Dev Velocity, Peekaboo with CodeQL, keep feeling fascination about DevOps and more. Dance if you want to, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Cloud-native development presents new challenges for security teams. Ephemeral workloads are scattered across services, and it's hard to identify resources, monitor configurations, and ensure compliance. Prisma Cloud by Palo Alto Networks is a comprehensive cloud-native security platform, delivering full-stack protection for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. It provides deep visibility, threat detection, and data security, as well as protection for hosts, containers, and serverless while enforcing policy guardrails. Visit securityweekly.com/Prisma Cloud to gain control over your cloud security.
This is episode 141, recorded March 1st, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, how are you? I was actually excited to go on air today because I figured that'd give us our chance to stop talking about Pokemon and 80s music and 80s movies, and I guess we're still at it.
Well, I hope you're a friend of mine, so start dancing, Mr. Kinsella. Also, do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list and join our Discord server, where we could find out more about New Wave Dance Party. If you missed Security Weekly Unlocked, you can now access all of the content on demand by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked and clicking the button to register or just log right in. Ted Harrington is the best-selling author of Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right, and the executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators, the company of ethical hackers famous for hacking cars, medical devices, web apps, and password managers. He's helped hundreds of companies fix tens of thousands of security vulns, including Google, Amazon, and Netflix. Ted has been featured in more than 100 media outlets, including The Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Forbes. His team founded and organizes IoT Village, an event whose hacking contest is a 3-time DEF CON Black Badge winner. Hello, Ted. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We're excited to have you, especially to talk about doing application security the right way, because I think it kind of implies there's perhaps a wrong way to do things. So maybe let's start off with, what kind of motivated you to write a book about this, and what were some of the things that might be surprising that people learned they're either not doing right or maybe just outright doing wrong?
Yeah, there were a couple factors that played into my desire to write this book, and desire is not even strong enough a word. The calling that I needed to write this book. There were two things, but before I describe that, I just want to put into context that I wrote this book because I saw that things could be done better. And although the opposite of doing something right is, of course, doing something wrong, I don't mean to imply that people out there are like stupid or ignorant or negligent or anything like that. But I definitely saw a lot of issues with the way that things were being approached. And so these two factors that really forced me to need to write this book, not even want, but need to write it, were the first thing I noticed was that I kept having the same conversation over and over and over again with whether it's our current customers or our prospective customers or people I meet at conferences or wherever. They all seem to iterate the same 10 or so different problems. Some of them were explicitly stated like, hey, I'm struggling with this. Or some of them were implied, like they didn't even realize the problem that was manifesting because of the actions they were taking or not taking. So that was the first thing I noticed, was that there were this commonality amongst pretty much everybody who's building software systems. The second thing I noticed was really the lightning strike that said, you have to do this. And that was when I started evaluating what are the common approaches to how you solve those 10 or so common issues. And the prevailing approaches, in my estimation, were largely backwards. And I rejected that. I couldn't stand to see that continue to persist. And I mean, because think about that, right? You got a company who is building some sort of software system. They recognize that security is important. They recognize there's some challenges to do it. So then they go out and try to seek the solutions to those challenges, and the solutions that they find out in the, in the wild, so to speak, are largely incorrect. And I felt that was just something that I couldn't stand to allow to keep happening, especially when I knew how to do it right. And so that was what motivated me to write this book. And that's what the book is about. It's just addressing these common issues that most people face, even if they don't realize they're facing it, and then what to do instead of the common misconceptions.
So yeah, and it's got to be perhaps a bit more constructive rather than just say, stop doing the wrong things, to turn it around a bit and say, here's a way to do it right. So let's dive into some of those, misconceptions or some of those, commonalities that you saw. What was one of the things that you wanted to, what was one of the challenges that you wanted to help redirect one of these companies into a more productive security solution?
Yeah, there's obviously many, a book that's structured around the misconceptions. There's a ton, but maybe a place to start would be the one that I saw. I mean, I did see this one every day and continue to see this one every day. And it's this misconception around what security testing even is. And what I mean by that is, when people are building software systems, if they have something that's worth protecting, and that's an important assumption that we call out, that you're not going to invest in security testing if what you're building doesn't protect something worth protecting. So let's just assume that we're talking about systems that have something worth protecting. People recognize that they have to go get some sort of testing done. And the common term that people often seek, and sometimes are explicitly instructed to go seek, is penetration testing. And the problem that I see with that term is that penetration testing actually means a very specific thing. And it's not usually the thing that people are intending when they go seek it. But what's even worse is that if you were to Google penetration testing right now, like do a Google search, most of the results that come back aren't actually even penetration tests. And so I wanted to really correct that and distinguish, what is a penetration test? What is vulnerability scanning, which is what most penetration testing, that's what most services that are being presented as penetration testing are really just scans. And what are vulnerability assessments, which are the things that people typically want. And so I essentially looked at what are the different, the outcomes that those different approaches actually deliver, and when you want to use which. And I think the metaphor to sort of compare them is if we think about it like a car, right? So when an automotive maker is manufacturing a car and they want to see how will it perform in a crash scenario, they'll actually emulate the crash scenario, right? So this is what a penetration test is kind of like. They'll literally crash the car into the wall and see what happens. And that's what penetration testing is like. It's actually executing a real world attack scenario, and the outcome's sort of binary. Just like in the crash test, you'd say, did the passenger survive or not? In this, you'd say, did the attacker get what they wanted? Did they escalate privileges or not? Whatever the particular thing is they're looking to do. But that's really different from vulnerability scanning, which is more like when your check engine light comes on and you go to Jiffy Lube or wherever, and they stick in that little diagnostic tool, and it quickly checks for known issues, and it says, okay, this is how you turn the check engine light off. That's kind of what vulnerability scanning is like. It's really quick, it's really easy, it's really inexpensive, but it's really not the same thing as penetration testing. Yet there's a third thing, which is vulnerability assessments, and this is what most people want. This is more like the entire automotive safety engineering department for a car maker, where they're considering how do all the systems work together, the airbags, the safety restraints, the side impact beams, the roll cages. How do all of these systems work together in order to increase the likelihood the passenger survives an impact? And that's really, vulnerability assessments are what most people are actually looking for when they're trying to invest in security testing. They're trying to say, help me understand my issues holistically, help me understand severity, and help me know how to fix the issues. And this is a long way of saying that that's a really complex problem, right? When someone says in their mind, they know that they need security testing to get better. They want to understand the issues holistically. They've heard this term penetration testing. They go ask for it. They're often sold something else, which is like the scanner. And that's really complex, especially if someone who's seeking those services doesn't understand that these issues are all at play. And so that was one of the big things that I really wanted to differentiate for people, is help them understand what is security testing anyway, and which do you need to get relevant to the goal that you're trying to achieve.
So yeah, let's unpack that a bit more, because I think sometimes it's good to educate people, but it doesn't perhaps matter as much about what we as security practitioners perhaps will define, the security testing, but maybe what the value is or the benefit they'll get out of that. So you kind of hinted to that some of this when you're just using the car metaphor, but how do you also then how do you turn that conversation into conveying the value of security testing? So, starting to educate them on, oh, this is the type of testing you need, and this is why it's going to help you. Here's the value.
Yeah, you're spot on in that this is not an exercise in memorization. The advice is not pull out your flashcards and make sure you've memorized these and you're using the terms right. And although I want people to use the right term to describe the right thing, I also know that only works if everybody uses the right term. And unfortunately, that's just like to get change across the many, many stakeholders and vendors and buyers and regulatory bodies. It's just almost an impossibility. So you're asking exactly the right question, is what are the outcomes that we should be talking about? And then of course, wrapped in that is how do we convey business value, which is a critically important thing for any security professional to be able to do. So the way that I think about that is I advocate that what people do is to start with the goal, right? So what happens currently, most people will say, I need penetration testing. But that's actually not where to start. Instead, you want to say, here's what I want to achieve. Because when you can start with what you want to achieve, then you can work backwards into the approach that best achieve that outcome. I mean, I hear almost every single day. I mean, this is I'm a partner in a consulting company that this is what we do for companies. We help them actually find and fix security vulnerabilities. And every day people come to us and they say, hey, can you help us with a pen test? And I'm like, probably. But first, let's hear what you actually want to achieve. And so from there, then it really kind of boils down to a few different things. So if you have a very mature, very hardened system, it's already gone through a lot of security testing, and you're really looking to emulate a real world attack scenario, then that's where penetration testing makes a lot of sense. But it really only makes sense for those more mature systems. If instead your goal is you want to do something very quick, very inexpensive, very cheap, you want to see the proverbial low-hanging fruit, that's where vulnerability scanning makes a lot of sense. Of course, with the understanding that with those trade-offs, it being quick and easy and inexpensive means that you're not really doing something very thorough. So there's going to be a whole lot of blind spots left unchecked. But nevertheless, it meets that goal. If you're saying, look, I just need something quick. Vulnerability scanning is really good for early stages in an assessment or as an interim between other assessments, stuff like that. Or that's where vulnerability scanning comes in. If your goal is that you want a more holistic understanding of your system, you want to understand the context of your vulnerabilities you want to understand your vulnerabilities in context of your threat model, you understand the severity of those vulnerabilities, you want to understand how to fix those vulnerabilities, and you want to actually prove that the remediations worked, that's where you would get a vulnerability assessment. And in some cases, you can kind of apply certain elements of each of these. So for example, we apply certain aspects of the pen testing process, but to the vulnerability assessment model. And we even use vulnerability scanning in the process for, some of the preliminary stages. So they are three distinct things. Sometimes you can blend them together, but really it comes down to what do you want to achieve and start from there.
So there's we've been focusing quite a bit on security testing because that's one way, of course, to understand just what does my app look like? Or, if you want to be pessimistic, how bad are things? Let me know so I can fix them. But maybe, security testing possibly isn't the only thing to do right around application security. So if we're approaching taking a goal-oriented approach to security testing, what else should or could organizations be thinking about when they want to do application security in a really good way?
Yeah, the way I organized my book was thinking about the process larger than testing. Because I do agree with you that security testing is only one piece of the puzzle. It's a very important piece for sure, but it's part of the overall process. And so I almost think about it in sort of 3 modes, and then each mode has a few pieces to it. But one mode is sort of, how do you prepare for the testing? And so that's things like, first of all, how do you think? What's your attitude about security? That sounds very squishy and like a soft skill in a very scientific field, but that's really important. And I can definitely tell stories about the difference between companies who think one way versus think another way. But how do you think? How do you share information? How do you find security partners? How do you work with them? What type of methodologies do you approach? We already talked about the testing itself, which is sort of the second mode, but that also entails not just the initial test, but then how do you deal with remediating issues? How do you then go back to verify that no new issues are introduced? And how do you deal with issues that will be introduced as things change? And then the third mode is really about business value, which is about understanding what is your overall threat model. How do you build security into the development process? How do you think about security as an investment in terms of like, what is the appropriate amount of time, effort, and money to spend? And then ultimately, what's the ultimate business outcome, which I argue is that a security done right delivers a competitive advantage. So those are all 3 really big areas. How do you think and how do you prepare? How do you test and remediate? And then how do you convert into business value?
So you pointed out some things about, trying to get around misconceptions about security testing, or sort of maybe refocus on what, that goal-oriented security testing. What have you seen around those aspects on the business side that you were talking about, that sort of end result that we've done the testing, we've found and fixed some problems perhaps, but we want to build security into that dev process. What are some good ways companies can make sure they're doing the right thing, or to think about and consider as they want to try and mature their processes, like you were talking about, understanding the maturity of how they would approach testing?
Well, let's start by talking about the ultimate outcome of security done right, because in so many ways, this is, as utopian as we might want to be and say that, security matters because in of itself, it matters and it's worth doing. It's like, being kind to your neighbor. You don't need compensation for that. You do it because it's the right thing to do. Nevertheless, when I think about progressive organizations, ones who are getting the best outcome out of security, how are they doing it? Why are they investing in it? I mean, I literally asked this question when looking at our own clients. I'm like, why do they spend money on us? And no doubt that because security is important is a big part of it, but it's obtaining that competitive advantage. And what I mean by that is that a well-secured solution and a solution that can prove that it is doing a good job of security, that's going to actually be more appealing for buyers of that solution as a subscription or as a license, or even from an acquiring standpoint, an M&A standpoint. That's going to be really appealing, and that's going to really stand out to those who can't. And most organizations can't. So let's think about it this way, right? Let's think about an enterprise buyer who's looking to license or subscribe to a software system that someone is building in order to solve some sort of business need. That enterprise buyer, they demand that the software systems they use be secure. This goes beyond software systems. This is, even vendors that they're using, like service providers, et cetera. But in the context of today's conversation, we're talking about software systems. So they demand that their supplier, their vendor, their software systems be secure. Yet most organizations really struggle to actually secure their solution and also prove that they have done an appropriate job at security. So think about it. Think about how crazy that is, right? The buyer wants X. Almost no one can provide X. So if you can provide X, that's hugely differentiating. And X in this case is, of course, secure your solution and then be able to prove that you're doing it appropriately. And that is an enormously differentiating competitive advantage.
So a lot of go ahead, John.
Really sorry, I'm not really buying it. So and I'm not saying that to insult you, but I'm looking for sell me on this, no pun intended. Yeah. We've both been in we've all been in industry for quite a while now. I personally have yet to see a company that they came to me and said, John, we want to give you more money so you can secure the product better so that we'll do better in the industry. I think we're starting to see over the last year or so, retail consumers care more about privacy with Apple and Google and that type of thing. I think there's some amount of care around security. It's usually, at least from what I've seen, it's a checkbox on the sales cycle. Maybe the buyer's looking to make sure you got your SOC 2. But maybe you have an example or two of where you've actually seen security win a deal.
Yeah, and there's an important distinction in your question that we should point out. I did not say that someone could charge a premium for security, which was the first part of the way you asked that question. Unfortunately, that is definitely not the case as well. I have not seen a case where a company would say these two software systems are equivalent in terms of every other feature set, but this one can prove security better, and I'm willing to pay more for that. But I see it every single day with our customers that being able to prove security moves the sales process along faster. So I'll give you a perfect example. Anyone who has tried to sell anything to an enterprise that has to do with protecting of any sort of information, so any software system, has to go through security questionnaires. Now, maybe not every enterprise asks this of every single software provider, but I don't know what the statistic is, but my guess would be the vast majority, well over 75%. I mean, it seems like everyone that I come across. And what the buyer's looking for is they've, got their huge list of questions or whatever. And we had a scenario where a client of ours, when they were going through that process, the buyer said, no, because of you violate this particular security control, and actually it's fundamental to your entire model, the way that the architecture is. And so until you redesign, we actually will, this is like a permanent no. And this is not a, go change this one little thing. This is like change the design of the system. And that was really demoralizing for our customer because they've been investing in security and had been, in my estimation, really doing it right. And so what we did next is this client of ours did something I thought was pretty smart. And they asked to have a meeting between the client and us and the and their client, our client, their client, and us. And in the course of that meeting, we were able to explain to this buyer the security process that was actually inherent in this the architecture itself. And they realized, our client's client realized, oh wow, this actually supports our security model, even though the way the control's written, it doesn't quite work, but it meets the spirit of what we're going for. So we're going to prove this. And they did. And so that client went on and signed this like mega deal with this enterprise. And they were amongst, 4 or 5 other competing solutions for that same work. And they were the ones who got it. And all the other ones had similar challenges with their architectural issue. And so that's an example right there of, I have examples too of where things happen faster or they unlocked bigger contracts, but there's an example of where a contract that was closed actually became open to them.
Yeah, there's aspects.
Cool. We'll keep the contract open.
Yeah, because I know Cloud Security Alliance, they have the vendor security questionnaires, and I think there are a few dozen questions at least, to the point where the CSA also has a security questionnaire light for vendors to fill out. And one of the other things the conversation also made me think of is that security shouldn't be a premium, especially if you look at Google or look up SSO tax, basically organizations that offer their SaaS, and you have to get the enterprise or pay extra to get the SSO capabilities for that. So so that's kind of some interesting ways where security shouldn't be a premium because it needs to fit into the enterprise easily. I want to continue this conversation, though, and sort of poke around a bit and say, Ted, you're looking at this, and there was, this conversation, with the client and the client's client sounded a lot of like interpreting or making sure that the security architecture was well done. And it's very difficult to do security testing and test your way into secure architecture. So what are some ways that you've approached companies to have that kind of mentality to figure out not just, and this goes back to a little bit, I think, what we're talking about with testing, but to not just say we need a test to prove our security, but we need a different way to demonstrate our architecture is secure, or basically ask some questions to say, this is how we've reduced some risk, perhaps, in the way we've architected our app.
Yeah, I love that question because it actually speaks to a common issue, a common misconception that a lot of companies have, which is that, well, we don't do security until the product is built and done and been in the market and got customers and is generating revenue, and then we have a customer demanding it. That's actually the way a lot of companies think about security. It's this thing that comes later, only when we have to. And then even then, as you correctly noted, it's difficult for certain types of testing to actually consider, well, what's the design look like? I actually advocate that security testing includes an analysis of the design. And I think it's actually the very first step of what appropriate security testing entails. Now, that only applies for certain methods. So, for example, vulnerability scanning, we mentioned before, it doesn't matter to a vulnerability scan how the system's designed. And that's actually one of the big drawbacks to scanning, that as a sort of the catch-all to all security testing that a lot of companies fall into. What you need to do is you need to actually understand, how does the system work? Because there's really, this is way oversimplifying things, but there's really two types of security vulnerabilities. There are implementation flaws, like you made it so that it would do X, but it didn't actually do X, it did Y. And that discrepancy between X and Y is what gets exploited. That's an implementation flaw. But then there's also design flaws, where you set out to make it do X, and it did exactly X. And X is, in fact, what's turned around and used in the attack against the system. So this is attacks like functionality abuse and chaining exploits. These are where this really comes to play. And so for that reason, yeah, organizations definitely need to understand the implications of how the system itself is designed, be able to articulate that. And one of the things that I constantly am advocating for is that you should be thinking about design, the security of the design in design, right? In fact, you should be thinking about it during requirements. When you're deciding what you're setting out to achieve and why, that's also when you should be thinking about security. I'm sure I am not the first person on your show to be advocating building security into the design, but this is definitely where that comes into play, because if you can account for security in the design process, that even gives you something that you can speak with your customers about as well, about like, here's how we've thought about the secure architecture. And that's very, very different from the way that most companies talk about security today, which is like, we use this type of encryption. And it's like, okay, well, those are features, but that doesn't necessarily talk to me about how it all works together.
So what are kind of riffing on this? What are some good ways that companies perhaps can think about communicating this? Because we were just talking just now about, is security really selling, or what is the competitive advantage that security is trying to tease out? Talking about the nuances of a control sounds like perhaps a missed opportunity, that the communication was failing there. So what's some ways that an organization can better describe, this is how we've approached our architecture, this is how we're reducing risk, this is how we're addressing a particular class of problems, rather than just saying we're doing a periodic scan or a periodic testing and that tells us we're secure?
Yeah, the abstract answer, which I'll start with, the abstract answer to your question is three things. The first thing, tell them your philosophy. Why do you believe what you believe about security? You're investing in security, why? And a lot of people skip that because they're like, I don't actually know why people skip that, but think about how we all as humans like to communicate or be communicated with. We always want to know why. And so that's the first thing. Tell your customers and prospective customers why you invest in security. Like, give them the why. And there's no right or wrong answer, but you believe in this as an investment. Why? The second is tell them what you did and show them, right? So this is where there is so much security through obscurity going on, right? Where companies will, they'll make claims like, oh, we do such and such testing. We do external penetration testing, whatever they call it. But then they don't really make that information easily available to anybody, to their customers. So tell them what you're doing, but then also make it available. And then the third is tell them how they can verify what you're saying. So oftentimes that would be either read our report, talk to this person from our security team, talk to our security consultant, whatever those things are. But what a lot of people try to do with communication is they try to be opaque about it, thinking that the person asking those questions will be okay being sort of stiff-armed. When instead it's much better to be like, look, I invest in security because we believe blank. And we do this type of testing on this cadence with this type of organization. You can verify what we're saying by downloading our reports here, and you can talk to the person in charge of security at this specific email address. It's really not that complicated. So that's the abstracted, the bigger, softer issue of how you do that. And then the more hands-on, tangible, how do you do it? I think about it in terms of there's a lot of different tactics that you can deploy. So certainly using your security assessment report, that's an amazing tool. Building a security-specific website that talks about these things in depth, in human language, in ways that someone reading it can understand and say, okay, I understand what you're doing now. It's like the number is so small of websites that I've seen do that part right. It's a great opportunity. And even things like make that easy to find. I mean, most companies don't have a security page on their website. When they do have it, they hide it in the footer, and it's usually under privacy and security. And I guess I don't have a huge problem if those are mixed together, but that word that I use is intentional, hide, right? Well, if security is something that is actually a differentiator, why not differentiate with it, right? Put it in the nav at the top. That's like, whatever, product, features, leadership, security. Wow, if there was a tab for security at the top, think of what that says about your company. Then when the visitor goes to that page, then they can actually hear from you describe what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, how to verify it. That's where a lot of these communication issues can, from a marketing standpoint, can be overcome. And then not from a marketing standpoint, but from a communication to customer standpoint, I think using security questionnaires as an opportunity to not just answer the question that's asked, but answer the spirit of what's being asked. I think that's a great thing. And then using your security consultants to help you in those conversations.
Well, on that theme of human language and presentations, you have a presentation coming up, I think, later this month. Do you want to give us just a quick preview of either what the topic is or how can people come find that?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about many of the themes that we talked about today. Actually, this is a perfect theatrical trailer for the upcoming talk. I'll outline some more specifics in that, and yeah, I'm excited to share some ideas. And if you wanted to understand more about these ideas or get a hold of me to get more clarity or figure out how to, follow me on social media, whatever, just go to hackablebook.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ted. This was a fun conversation, and hopefully some people will start, thinking about doing security right and approaching this with from the security side as well, approaching this with some empathy and starting that conversation more constructively than just saying, hey, you're doing it wrong. Stop doing it wrong.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I agree. Security is about getting better. It's not about taking each other down. It's not about, calling people out. It's about how do we, as a team sport, go win the game together. So that's my hope. That's why I'm here to serve today in this podcast and in the talk. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. And speaking of team sport, want to thank John, as always, for joining me. And thanks everyone who's hanging out in Discord and listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.